and I'm excited to share with you today what I've been working on for the past year with the Woods Institute for the Environment, as Marcelo mentioned. So, the title of my talk is, What Are They Doing Right in Yakima? And it's a qualitative study in collaborative watershed policymaking of the, are you ready for this, Yakima River Basin Integrated Water Resource Management Plan. And throughout this presentation, I'll refer to it as the Integrated Plan for convenience. And the group that created this plan was actually nationally recognized in 2012 when this agreement to move forward with this plan was created. And there's talk of it being a model for watershed management across the West. So I think first, before we begin to apply it as a model across the West, we need to first understand how this group of decades-old enemies came to this consensus agreement in the basin. And though I've asked myself this question in many different ways, the core question of what I'm going to be exploring today is what led to the agreement to adopt the Yakima Integrated Plan. And this is how we'll explore it. First, we'll start by looking at the problems in the Yakima Basin before the plan's adoption. And then I'll go through my methods, or in other words, how does my study attempt to explain what led to the agreement to adopt this plan? And finally, my findings, what insights does my study provide? So let's first start by looking at Yakima. First off, who knows where Yakima is? Want to shout it out?
Washington.
Yeah. Are you from Washington State? Or is anyone here from Washington State? Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about Yakima?
Not much.
No?
No.
Never, not heard a lot about it. So there's a bunch of water users in this basin, but the number one water use in this basin is agriculture. Does anyone want to guess what fruit is? Yeah, apples, exactly. Apples. From this little region in Washington, we actually produce 2/3 of the nation's apples. Yeah, 60%, 66%. So 2/3 led to this concern over the water shortage, one of which was, this is a billion-dollar economy in Washington, and when the water is cut down due to water shortages, that significantly affects the yields of the crop. So the first problem that led to water shortage was overappropriation, which meant that there was actually more water rights given out to water users than there was actually water in the river, just because of the messy way that the Western water rights are handled. And the second driver was intense drought. There were several droughts that happened in the 20th century that actually gave only 30% of the promised water rights to these agricultural deliverers, and of course that affected their profits. And it's not just the agricultural economy that's affected, it's also the salmon. The salmon that the Yakima Indian Nation relies on, which is local, are going extinct. Before the dams were put up in this area, they numbered in the hundreds of thousands annually, and now 3 species are extinct, and so the Yakima Indian Nation has brought this to the attention of the government. Now, what does this plan provide? How does it tackle all of these different issues? So I want to show you a short video that will illustrate for us several of the problems. Of course, it's not making. Well, the gist of that video is that the economic health of the region is, dependent on the agriculture, and that it's compounded with climate change and the population growth that is expected to happen across the West, increasing the needs of the water. So I mentioned some of the actors in the basin, like the Yakima Indian Nation and the irrigators. These actors are not only stakeholders that are affected by the plan, but they are also representatives on the Yarb-Webb work group, which created the plan. So what is the Yarb-Webb work group, and who else is involved in this plan? The Yarb-Webb work group stands for the Yakima River Basin Water Enhancement Project Work Group, and it comprises a number of interests. They all assembled in 2009, and they came to this agreement, to this preliminary plan. And then there are also other actors in the basin that were actually not formally part of this work group that helped create the plan. So there were past efforts to create a solution to water shortage in the basin, and I want to provide some of that context. Do you see a recurring theme here? a lot of the past efforts have been in light of these huge droughts that have happened, and they have spurred this action. It's known as crisis management. Department of Ecology initiates this adjudication, and the main point is that big drought caused a lot of these things to happen in the past. One of the more recent droughts had business interests lobbying for storage. So the storage study was started by the Bureau of Reclamation, which was the federal stakeholder, and is pushed for funding for this study that was only devoted for studying storage solutions in the basin. And that plays an important part later, but basically a lot of the stakeholders were not happy with just having this one solution, because they didn't think that this one approach was the right way to approach this problem. And so this alternative study was started by the state. And that's when the work group was initiated, and they came to this Yakima Integrated Plan Agreement in 2 years. And so another way to pose my research question is that these efforts in the past did not lead to an acceptable solution to the basin. What was different about the Yakima Integrated Plan, and what changed this time around? So to answer this question, this is how I structured my study. I used qualitative methods because qualitative methods are good for seeing how phenomenon arise and seeing exactly what were the factors of success that led to the development of this plan. So the main method I use is stakeholder analysis, in which I interview a bunch of the stakeholders in the basin and through the telephone, and see what their interests were at specific times and what contributed to that development of the plan. So what I did was I conducted 14 interviews with stakeholders, about 45 to 50 minutes, and I coded them in Vivo, a qualitative software. And then I applied these codes based on literature that was based on, that explains successful collaborative watershed planning groups. And after applying these codes, I identify broader themes. And this is what coding kind of looks like. This is an example transcript that I have, and this is in vivo, first of all. This is the interface, and these stripes represent they're basically labeling segments of the transcript in which I found specific factors. And qualitative analysis software doesn't make the connections. That's the researcher's job to explain why, for example, this passage seems really code heavy, so what was important about it. So now, after going through some analysis, what insights does my study provide? These are my key findings. One, and they're structured based on 3 different levels, so it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. First one was that I found that grassroots groups united on their shared values to move forward. The second one was I found that state and federal leaders pushed this initiative forward after listening to the grassroots groups. And finally, when the work group was created, there was this consistent emphasis on this balanced approach, that no one would be in front of anyone else, that we would move together. So now I want to share some quotes from the interview. From the Yakima Nation, You know, we fought tooth and nail with Rosa Irrigation District in our long history. We don't have a friendly relationship with them prior to this. Well, we came together and we both agreed we can't go forward with that proposal called Black Rock. Do you remember that storage study, 2003? This was the Black Rock proposal, and this was, they found that it was too expensive. It created more problems than solutions. And so the Yakima Nation wrote to the government saying we need to change directions, and it was co-signed by the irrigators, so they were also a part of the Yarb Work group, right? That shocked the valley. It was a game changer, I guess is what they call it around here. And so these actors, the Yakima Indian Nation and the Rosa Irrigation District, were fighting throughout the 20th century, and they came together in realizing that there is a better way than this Black Rock proposal. And from the Rosa Irrigation perspective, our relationship started with the mutual concern that the storage study was not being properly conducted, that the whole study needed to start over and be done in a different manner. We realized that our interests were more similar than different. Together we could convey a lot of power, and so together they created this power through allyship. So for the first finding, there was this sense of urgency compounded by drought, climate change, and this growing water need because of the growing irrigation economy and the growing population. And these stakeholders were, the Yakima and the Rosa were just one example where that happened. There was this frustration over this lack of progress, and they recognized that there was power in collaboration over their mutual distaste for the Black Rock proposal. Now, for the second finding, I found that the state and federal leaders actually listened to this joint letter because it shocked the valley, as the Yakima representative shared. But the storage study was government-driven, and they didn't listen to any of us that tried to provide input. We finally just got fed up until both the state and the federal government said, this isn't working, it's going down the tubes, it's time to take a different direction. We got leadership at Borough and leadership at Ecology, which are the federal and state holders, to agree with us, and that's when things started to rapidly change. And along with this was the finding that came with a little bit of having the leaders in the right position, having the right people in the right places. So in a sense, there was a little bit of luck that played into it. We had all these senators, all these Congress members, the governors, that all supported moving forward with this integrated approach, this integrated alternative to the Black Rock study. And they supported this initiative through various efforts. For example, one of the example of this efforts was the adjudication, this basin-wide adjudication. And what an adjudication is it clarifies the water rights in the entire basin. And so it's an expensive and really time-consuming process. It's actually still going on now. It was initiated in 1977, but it helped to, as the reclamation representative shared here, the adjudication was pretty much wrapping up, so the basin water rights holders, including the Yakima Nation, had a very good idea of what their water entitlements are. So everybody at that point was a lot more comfortable in talking about the ultimate solutions, knowing what their entitlements were. And so this sense that we don't know, this sense of uncertainty was cleared up because of the adjudication. So in sum, after the letter, the federal and state governments agreed and answered the call from the Rosa and Yakima. And one instance was the state initiated the adjudication, which confirmed rights and reduced the conflicts in the basin. Governor Jay Inslee at the time, he was actually a former Natural Resources Committee chair. His first legislative action as governor in 2012 was this Water, Jobs, and Fish bill for the State Department of Ecology to implement this Yakima integrated plan. So my third finding was that this work group was committed to this balanced approach, and that sense was fostered throughout. So the citizens group was not part of the work group, but his observation was that everybody's who's at the table is getting what they want. Maybe not every last thing that they want, but they're getting enough out of the plan without sacrificing too much of what they value to push it forward. A county commissioner, so a representative from the local government, said that I think the real key to it, overall I think the balanced nature of the plan I think is really important. The fact that you've got members advocating for every aspect I think is important. But I think the real key to it is that everything moves together proportionally and incrementally. We're not putting one interest in front of the other. And there seems to be a real commitment to that. And this just emphasizes that because of that, everyone was supporting every other person's interest, and that helped move it forward. So everyone was willing to compromise, everyone was willing to put their essentials forward, and that the people who agreed from the start were involved before 2009, and opposition was mostly outside of the work group because of that. So some of these might be obvious, but it helps to point out that watershed partnerships should prioritize in the development of the implementation of the basin management plan. Because there are so many, the literature provides many different instances. In some cases, they contradict each other. What leads to a successful watershed partnership objectively? And so I found that through the case study of the Yakima, a lot of it is contextual actually in Yakima. We had all these political leaders in the right places who were all very environmentally minded and were very supportive of the plan from the start. And so that was one instance of where one interviewer said the stars aligned. Work group meetings were a way for stakeholders to express their shared value and their mutual concern, and that helped reduce the conflict in the basin. And it provided a forum for these stakeholders to listen to each other, which didn't really exist in the past. You had 5 different initiatives moving forward, trying to tackle the solution because everyone's frantic about this drought that's occurring. And so you have separate initiatives led by several different people, and it wasn't until this basin study was initiated that brought all of them together at the same table. I also found that only some of these findings are actionable. For example, the adjudication and having supportive meeting rules that foster the sense of openness. And some of them was not, as I explained before. And some of the challenges that this work group talked about when moving forward with implementation of the plan, because agreement was just, we're going to do this, but now we have to implement it. Maintaining these relationships through implementation. For example, there's this sense of really high turnover rate with these workers in the work group, and the sense that we have to pass on these relationships through the next generation who is going to implement this plan. For example, there's one instance where the plan holders actually secured $100 million from the state government to purchase watershed plan to protect this habitat. And this wasn't an original part of the plan, but the work group all saw it as necessary to help keep the environmental stakeholders a part of the agreement because, as one stakeholder said, you have dams in this plan, and environmental interests are usually, against having more dams. And another challenge is securing funding, of course. Implications for, and again, this does not just have implications for watershed partnerships, but also for negotiations theory and collaborative policymaking in other settings. I think it's an interesting case study because of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldric.